Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Fireside chat on this Thursday afternoon. Hope everyone's having a great day. Um, I am super excited to talk to Peter Rice, who is the COO at CCX. I guess it's easier to say Chief Operating Officer at CCX, and also a Dartmouth MEM alum. For those of you joining us for the first time, and if you've not heard about MEMPC, we are the Master of Engineering Management Programs Consortium. We are a group of Master of Engineering Management graduate programs, and we are working together to raise awareness and visibility of MEM as a degree. So welcome. Let's get started. Sorry, one more thing about logistics. If you have any questions for Peter, please feel free to let us know using the Q&A box at the bottom on the bottom panel of your Zoom screen, and we'll answer them towards the end of the session. Thank you. All right, Peter, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks, Ritu. It's nice to be here. Really appreciate you inviting me to do this and taking the time to share a bit of my experiences with people.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. So, Peter, you've had a long journey with startups. Would you like to take us through and introduce yourselves, please?
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, Peter Rice. I'm currently the Chief Operating Officer at CCX and a Dartmouth MEM, graduated in 2006. Prior to that, I did my undergraduate at Colby College in Maine, studied math and physics there, and did a dual degree program with Dartmouth. So I was at Dartmouth my junior year and then a fifth year for a bachelor's of engineering, and then stayed for my MEM. And then right after graduating, moved here to the DC area where I still live, and worked at a company called alum.com. It's a startup at the time. There were about 15 employees, and unique in that it was incubated within a large publicly traded company called MicroStrategy. But it's kind of its own entity within that, and was there for 10 years from, like I said, 15 people as a startup through an IPO, and a bunch of different roles there. And I think we'll get into what some of those roles were. And then I spent a year as chief of staff for the CEO at Formlabs, having moved up to Boston for that. And then did that for a year, and then joined CCX, where I first did a little bit as chief of staff for about 6 months, and then we raised our first round and joined full time as CEO. And yeah, I'm sure we'll get into some more details about what each of those companies did and kind of different aspects of what I did, but that's kind of the trajectory for things. And I am back in Northern Virginia, outside of Washington, DC, live here with my wife and 3 kids. So oddly enough, my oldest is a freshman in high school and starting to think about college. It's like weird that he's closer in age to the MEM than I am now, but that's I guess that's the progression of time, and you can't help it.
Yes, that is true. Like, I see a lot of the incoming students coming through, and I realize how long it has been since I graduated from
Right.
MEM. So it has been an interesting journey to see the evolution of the degree and how it has shaped. You're one of the few graduates who decided to do their MEM right after undergraduate. Was there a rationale behind that?
Yeah, my first answer is always a little bit of a joke, and it's that my then girlfriend still had another year at Dartmouth, and so I needed to stay for her. It worked out. She's now my wife, and kind of we've had a wonderful life together. But that's not the only reason. As I mentioned, I had studied math and physics, and then moved to engineering, and there was this progression, pretty natural progression for me, from pretty hard sciences, moving more towards the management side of things and applying technology to different kind of ways of how it could actually be applied to humanity, let's say. And I thought Dartmouth in general does a very good job of a liberal arts education tied with engineering, so you're already getting a little bit of that exposure. And the MEM seemed like a very natural progression for me to take some of that technical knowledge and how I wanted to apply it back into the world, kind of take technical principles, but like actually apply them in use cases that could be used by society in different ways. So I think that was a lot of it for me is being able to know that I could take that skill set that was technical, but also add some of the kind of softer skills beyond that. And I was, admittedly, I think I was trying to decide, do I go for more like a Master of Science than a PhD route? Or do I want to kind of maybe move into industry? And I think the MEM was really helpful. I still did research, just I'd already been doing research at a lab at Dartmouth, and I continued to do that. But it became very clear once I got into project management classes or some of the corporate finance. I took an entrepreneurship class. All those classes made it very clear, oh, I want to go into kind of corporate world and do some of that. Still closely tied to engineering, and I've always worked at tech companies. But that was definitely the kind of the helpful progression for me to see, okay, I do want to move in that direction away from the hard sciences into something that's more business-like.
That is awesome. And I think that is a question we get a lot. Like, do I need work experience before I start MEM, or can I start right out of undergraduate? And yours is a perfect example. If you know that you are leaning towards it, then you can, come to MEM right out of after undergraduate and just learn as you go as to what you really like and where you want to specialize in going forward.
Yeah.
And also, what is unusual about your journey is that you work in, I want to say startups, but smaller companies. Started working in smaller companies, and you continue to work with smaller companies and startups going forward. Was that intentional? Because a lot of the students shy away from the smaller companies because they feel like there's a little bit more security with the larger multinational organizations. So what attracted you to startups?
Yeah, I think certainly as I think that same progression was happening for me of um, enjoying the science part of things, but also wanting to get involved in kind of people management, project management, different aspects of it. And I generally enjoyed being kind of, some people would say spread thin, but a jack of all trades. And so I was looking at consulting, which I think often gives you a lot of exposure to different industries and different parts of an organization, and some of these rotational leadership programs that some of the big companies have, and considered, kind of that would be a way to get exposed to different areas of a company. But thankfully, the CEO at alarm.com, where I went, had done one of those leadership programs at GE and was basically going to create that within this tiny organization, right? It was like me, like there were three of us that started at the same time, and we were employees like 15, 16, and 17. It was pretty funny. And we were going to do this rotational program. And for me, what really attracted me to it is like the reality of I wouldn't just do a rotation somewhere, do it and kind of then leave it and then go somewhere else. I had friends who did do that at some big organizations, and they even moved every 6 months to different factories or different offices in different parts of the world. Whereas I stayed in the same place, and I was joking, I actually just piled on. So at the end of 2 years, I had 4 jobs instead of just, I didn't really rotate. I just kept doing things. But as I was in those rotations or those different experiences, it really mattered, right? It wasn't like I was doing this to learn so that then maybe I'd end up in a leadership position. It was like, well, we really need this product launched, or we really need to figure out how to build this billing system, or whatever the different things were that I did. And so it was like playing with like live ammunition. And so that was a lot of what was attractive to me. But you brought up risk, and that is a really kind of very valid thing that if you're going to work for a startup or a small company, there's a lot more risk. And I think for me at the time, it was, I was young. I mean, it was me and my wife, it was just the two of us. She had a job too. Like if things didn't work out, it would have been okay. And I was very lucky that alarm.com was part of MicroStrategy, this, big publicly traded company. So like benefits were decent, things like that. And then the fact that we had success there meant since then I've been able to be a bit riskier, just having a cushion where I kind of, fall back if things didn't work out at one of the jobs. But yeah, I think you really need to think about what your tolerance for risk is and kind of what some of the things are that you might be able to fall back on. Whether that's, you can move back in with your parents if something doesn't work out, or you have other options for other jobs, kind of, and being an engineer or kind of certainly an engineering management degree, it's not always going to be super fast, but it is possible to get other jobs. It's not, I think there's lots of people that look for kind of applicants with this skill set. So I always felt like even if this doesn't work out, I'll have some good experiences that will help me get the next job, and it'll be okay. So yeah, it's risky for sure.
Yeah, but on the flip side of it, it sounds like it was very impactful, right? Because you said you were employee 15, 16, 17, and things you were working on were things they needed and not something they would just give a rotational program attendee, they're like, this is what we need to move forward. And you can see the impact to the organization right then and there. Now, admittedly, when you joined alarm.com, it was a small company, but by the time you left, it had grown, right? What was the experience scaling an organization that was that small from 15 people to say 200, 500 odd people when you finally left?
Yeah, it's even though it was the same name of a company, like it was really 3 or 4 different versions of that company, and it really felt very different. And I kind of feel like it's like seeing your own kids versus your friends' kids, where like if I only see a kid every 2 years, I'm like, oh my gosh, they changed so much. But as you're living through it day to day, it doesn't the changes don't happen. But then there's these moments where like all of a sudden it kind of stands out to you how different things are. I remember it was like probably 2 or 3 years in, we had we had all of our hires start at the same time, and there were 35 new hires, and we only had 30 people at the company. So like the next day, there were more new people than old people. And that's just like, it's kind of shocking just to some extent to realize, wow, like how do we help all of them understand the culture? There's all this lingo, all these acronyms, all these things that you really need to train them on. And I was really lucky that I was given some freedom to help with the onboarding. So we did a week-long onboarding. Everybody's kind of learning the same things, getting exposed to things. I know they still do some onboarding like that, which I think is unique for a company that small, spending that much time to train new people onto the team. But it was really impactful. And then there's these like moments where like you get to 150, 200 people, and now you don't know everybody's name. Or you see someone, you're like, I've never seen this person before. Maybe they're interviewing or something. You ask them and they say, oh, I've been here for like 2 months. And you're like, wow, how is this happening? And then as we got closer to the IPO, I remember one day just going into where like the finance and accounting team was, and there's all of a sudden there's like 35 people in there that you don't need unless you're going to be a public company just to keep track of all these things. And again, these are just these like milestones or like mileposts where like all of a sudden you're like, things are changing. It's the different company. But as far as kind of going through those transitions, I already mentioned culture. I think that's one that's really important. And how do you share the culture, and each person that joins is going to influence that culture, especially early on. And so how do you kind of just thinking about how do we do that? And I really appreciated that we did company retreats pretty regularly. And again, one of those things where being at a small company, the CEO is like, hey, you guys have a budget of whatever the budget was, and me and 2 other relatively new people were like told, okay, go make it happen. So we went and found places to go, and you build that, and it's an opportunity to step away from the day-to-day work, share, here's some of our values, here's the goals, so everybody knows what the goals are for the company, and do that. And that's the type of thing which I've tried to bring in kind of subsequently, and certainly now at CCX, where I'm back to the like 10 to 15 person size company. How do we get together regularly? How do we make sure we share that information to keep the culture across the organization? The other thing that I think is important to think about is just the maturity of systems and processes. And I spent a lot of time, my last 5 years at alarm.com was director of program management. And really what I was thinking about is how do we add systems and processes to the technology organization? And I remember like talking with our chief software architect quite a bit about, okay, let's just manage everything in Excel. And once it's really easy to change your process or change, what data do we need to track, all this other stuff. You can really easily make a change and then be able to, kind of, once you have the process in place and you've done it for a few months and it hasn't changed that much, okay, now let's go put it into like a real system. And so Jira is something that we spend a lot of time implementing. And Jira is pretty flexible, but some other tools just take a long time to set up, and then it's really hard to make changes. And you want to kind of do that when you're at the right level of maturity in an organization. If you do it too early, now you spend all this time changing what the process is and like fighting against the software to maybe make it do what you want it to do. Whereas if you just do something lightweight, again, Excel being the example I would use, but it's a lot easier to make those changes if it's just an Excel on my laptop as opposed to like, do you implement Salesforce? Like that's a big commitment and changes are hard. So that's another area that kind of it stands out to me as kind of things I was thinking about.
Yeah, and I can imagine even getting the buy-in and getting people to use the processes that you plan to implement going forward, right? You will always be co-creating for the first few months because everybody has their input and people who are actually using it, that's when the plan meets the reality
Right.
kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So um, when I worked at Motorola, we found it really hard to get adopted, processes adopted, because I was
Right.
part of systems engineering team, and every new step was like met with a collective groan every single time, right? I don't know, was it similar at startups, or was it something? Was it
Uh,
easier?
it's easy sometimes just because there's fewer people that will groan at you. Um, so and then kind of as you bring people on, they kind of learn this is the established process. But certainly that doesn't mean that the groaning stops. That certainly happens. And I think just bringing people along to buy into what you're doing, and as you mentioned, kind of having them co-create it, and that's certainly easier at a smaller organization, right? If you have 150 people, you can't have all of them co-create anything. But having representatives from the different groups who are going to maybe be evangelists within the rest of the organization for you, or just bringing in that perspective to help you understand, for me at Alarm, it was always, do the product managers, engineers, QA, DevOps, do all of these teams kind of agree with the process maybe that we're trying to implement? So, you know,
Yeah, that that is always a fascinating process, just seeing people interact with something you've created and move it, take it forward.
yeah.
And now you were at Alarm for a very long time, right? Was it hard making the decision to switch from Alarm to Form Labs?
Um, in in um in some ways it definitely was. I mean, it was the only job I'd ever had. But the kind of the two things that pushed me over the edge. One was just the realization towards the end that like it'd been probably 18 months where my job was now very much the same every day. Maybe you're deploying different technology or you're doing things a little bit differently, but really the job started to feel stagnant to me. And there's certainly a path where I could have just kept doing that. There could have been interesting things about the job, for sure, but it would have been more of the same, right? Like kind of the amount of things that I was involved with had narrowed down quite a bit. And I met with our CEO, we had lunch, and he said, I think it might be time for you to leave. He's like, I mean that in a nice way, but I think it might be, kind of like given what I wanted to do, I wanted to move into like a COO type role. And there were already people with that. I didn't want to take that job from any of the people that I was reporting to. So it made sense to make a change at that point. And I mean, certainly not easy, but then it gave me an opportunity to also reflect on kind of what is it that I want out of my career and things that I care about. And certainly one of the things was I want to move into kind of this, the C-suite, to have that exposure to like the board and things like that. And I also spent some time thinking about what are maybe some of the challenges that are facing, I guess, my generation and that I want to be involved with. These aren't the three things that I came up with are not the things that must be universal for everybody, but they're three things that I care about for different reasons. And I wanted to move into that space. And those three are healthcare, education, and energy. They're kind of just three things that stood out. Partially just, kind of, my own family thinking about their things, and then kind of the different aspects of society that seemed interesting to me. And Alarm had little pieces of all of that. Form Labs also had little pieces of that. Obviously, CCX being directly in the healthcare space, it was most obvious that's what I was going to do. But that was kind of that helped frame my decision making. It's okay, I want to move towards the C-suite, and I wanted to be in one of these three areas. And so that was really the decision point to leave Alarm and go to Form Labs.
And you have a very interesting story about how your transition from Form Labs to CCX came about. Um, would you like to share that with us?
Sure. Yeah. So the CEO here at CCX is my cousin, Nathan Sigworth, and we were actually at Colby and at Dartmouth together. We were roommates at both schools, and he started engineering and then he moved to I think economics, but he actually reached out to me while I was at Forum Labs, really to be an angel investor in CCX. So we got together, and it was clear to me that my time at Forum Labs was coming to an end. And so I decided I was like, well, what if I joined you and gave you my time instead of just writing a check? And so that's why I joined. And I did, I mean, as I mentioned, I was chief of staff and only part-time for about 6 months, because we thought it would be fun to work together, but we really wanted to confirm that. So we spent, 6 months where I was like not fully committed, but really enjoyed the experience and found that we really balance each other's strengths out very well. And so it worked nicely for us to work together. And so we actually raised the first round of funding, and this was late 2018. And then I joined full-time as COO.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about CCX. It is not a very well-known name, but I would love, as you said, it's in healthcare, and I would love to learn more.
Yeah, so we build software for market access, both for payers and pharma. And so I'll try and explain what that means. So after a drug or a new therapy is approved medically, so kind of in the US, it's the FDA, or in Europe, it's EMA, that approves the drug and basically says it's safe and effective. So nobody gets hurt when they take it, and it does what you think it does, and kind of improve people's lives. Then it enters into this market access phase where, and let's set the US aside because we do everything a little bit differently here, but in the rest of the world, it enters into this market access phase where you're trying to determine between the payers and pharma how much should you reimburse for this treatment. Sometimes it takes place and looks like a negotiation. But there's different elements to it as well. There's something called the health technology assessment, where you're evaluating at what value would you be able to, would you be willing to pay for what you're receiving? And then how does it impact budgets, and how does it relate to the existing standard of care? And so, and this does happen to some extent to the US, it's just a different process. But that market access process, the negotiation piece, can take kind of on average in Europe, like 18 months. And so during that time period, kind of everybody loses, right? The drug is now technically approved from a medical perspective, but no one's receiving it. So the patients aren't getting the latest treatments. From a pharma perspective, there's obviously a lack of revenue. And if you are a government payer, your constituents, the patients, aren't getting the latest, most novel treatments. And so it's kind of a failure on all parts. So if you can shorten that time, we think it's a win-win-win for all of the parties involved. And so we started by building a negotiation platform that actually allowed companies and payers to actually do the negotiations digitally. It turns out it's really hard to convince governments and pharma companies to work with brand new startups on really high profile negotiations. And so we pivoted to software that's going to help prepare them for those negotiations. So we have a planning tool that lets you put in like what the structure of a deal might be, and then see what either the revenue or budget impact might be. And then a project management workflow, which helps them walk through the various steps of a negotiation. And then finally, a deal catalog where you can keep track of all the deals that you do have in place and pull out analytics for those. So before you go to your next negotiation, you might say, well, this pharma company tends to like a discount around X%, or they always want to do outcomes-based agreements, and this is how they structure them. Those are the types of insights that you might be able to bring out from our tool. And the nice thing about all of those is that they can be bought and used by a single entity, so just the payer or just the pharma, but they can be extended to be something that works across both organizations. And then our goal is to get back to doing the negotiations digitally and do more of those. We have done a few on the platform, but we're now focused on a different area. So.
Wow, sounds exciting, right? That's the part of pharma or healthcare you'd never get to see, because by the time you're there trying to get a drug, it's already gone through that process, if you will.
Yeah, there's been a lot of emphasis in the market to add tools for the drug discovery piece. So there's a lot of, how do you plan a drug trial, or how do you even evaluate which molecules might be the best molecules? And then once it gets into the healthcare system, how do we deliver those those treatments, and how do we, kind of, there's a whole world around how do we actually receive the payment, but there's this middle layer of the market access piece, which doesn't have a lot of attention, which is why we're focused on it.
Cool. And it sounds like it's not just like your customers are varied, right? It could be like another organization buying the drugs. It could be a government buying the drugs, right? So your customers, if you will, from the payer side of things
Yeah,
are.
it's sometimes governments, it could be insurance companies,
Mhm.
there's GPOs, there's a bunch of different entities that all might be reimbursing for a treatment.
Right.
And how do you kind of reach that conclusion on how much that's going to be for?
Yeah. So what does being a chief operating officer at a company that builds tools for market access look like?
Yeah, it's easier to say the things I don't do. I'm normally not involved in sales, and I actually don't write any code for our software, but almost everything else falls under my responsibility. So if you think about legal, HR, IT sometimes, marketing at times I've done, but it really is kind of all the other aspects to make sure that the company is running. And we're unique in that we're a US based company and kind of Delaware C Corp, but we do have subsidiaries in Europe. And so we've hired people in other countries, and we have accounting firms in different countries. So there's a lot of coordination across different organizations in different parts of the world. But what the way I look at it is I'm trying to make sure that everyone else, especially on the engineering side and the sales side, can just do their jobs, and they're not having to worry about anything else. Kind of keep everything else going, make sure everybody gets paid on time, make sure, we know where the money is in the bank, make sure contracts get signed quickly, things like that. So kind of all those other areas are the things I'm responsible for, and have those two parts of the organization, which I think are the ones kind of adding value, kind of have them not have to worry about any of this stuff.
Yeah.
That's a simple way of, there's a lot of different things I do, but
Yeah, I think that's the joy of being in a startup as well, right? Yeah,
yeah.
or rather smaller company, if you will. Um, and what are some of the more exciting aspects of being a chief operating officer?
Yeah, for me, I mean, I'm sure you've seen kind of throughout the trajectory of my career, I've really enjoyed being in lots of different areas of what's going on. And getting to interact with people in different areas. And some of this has really just been like a continued desire to learn more. And so it's kind of a continued part of my education to learn different aspects of things. Um, and so yeah, that's certainly part of it. Just being exposed to these different areas. The other thing is just I do get to see that full process of, like, what are the decisions we need to make on the engineering side to, kind of how do we make priority decisions, being a part of those conversations, and then, helping our sales team, like, how do we actually get these customers who seem excited about what we're doing, get them across the finish line? What are the concessions we need to make? How do we think about these different things? So I do really like the responsibility of trying to think through all these different areas and different ways in which you kind of think about how to prioritize, how to make decisions between different things that all seem exciting, and kind of the next best thing that you could work on. So it's a lot of time thinking about those types of challenges. And just the variety. I mean, I mentioned one of the reasons to leave Alarm is that my job felt like it was getting very stagnant, and there's other interesting parts of it, but really what I was doing every day seemed very similar, and that is not the case. It's like for the last 4 years, I don't think I've had 2 days that look at all the same next to each other. Every day is something new, some new challenge, and that's exciting for me. I really enjoy that.
Yeah, I can see that. I can hear that in your voice, which is pretty cool. Um, and it sounds like a lot of things that you are talking about are a lot of the things that a lot of the MEM students learn while going through the course, right? Would you say that the skill sets that you learn from MEM, you kind of use them even now? And then my second question, kind of addition to
Yeah.
that, is what are some of the skill sets that you would say are required to succeed in a startup or entrepreneurial environment, if you will?
Yeah. The like all the time, I feel like I'm going through doing something, and I'm thinking back to I feel like I heard about this during the MEM or kind of one of those classes. There's certainly a lot of times probably the one that comes up the most, and this may just be like the last few years that I've been focused on it, is really corporate finance class. So just thinking about, okay, like I'm thinking about that stuff all the time. Whether it's putting together financials that we're then going to use to talk to investors to raise more money, or just thinking about how do I, make sure that we're keeping track of the cash correctly between the different organizations that we have, and FX challenges, things like that. So that's an area, but also I think about, I'm helping the team think about how do we grow and how do we add people to the team. When do we need different, I remember like in class learning about like a liaison, right, between different parts of an organization. And I did a lot of that throughout my career, but also just thinking about what are those positions, what do they look like as we grow the team and as we add people, how do we, there are different ways to organize a group of people, and kind of how do you put that together. But also, there are just so many different ways of things that I think about that go back to the MEM classes, and I think also the fact that I can talk with our engineering team and understand to some extent the things that they're working. I've stayed kind of abreast of how things happen on the engineering side because I've been close to engineers my whole career. Even though I haven't written any code, but just being able to engage in that conversation. And I think sometimes really, especially seeing the challenges of communication from non-engineers to engineers and being able to step in and try and help translate that. I think that's probably the thing that the MEM has served me the most throughout my entire career is you understand what the business people are talking about and you understand what the engineers are talking about, and helping to ask questions, help them translate to each other so that they're not missing each other. And it's sometimes fascinating to watch how you hear what somebody is saying and the other side is just not understanding it the same way. So you spend time kind of thinking about that. And I think again, the MEM is really helpful with that. I think so that's the MEM. What was your second question? Sorry, I know I had some thoughts.
No worries,
on
no
that,
worries. I think you're right. I think a lot of what MEM teaches is translation, right? I mean, you could be using the same terms, but they mean different things to different people. And then
Right.
there's the whole miscommunication, the potential for miscommunication over there. My question was, what are some of the skill sets and mindsets that you think are required to succeed in a startup or an entrepreneurial environment? Where's, if
Right.
you
Yeah, I think probably the most important thing is being willing to try new things, even when you have no real experience in it sometimes. And I think about actually kind of finance and accounting is a really interesting one. Yeah. So I took the corporate finance course as part of the MEM. And then early at alarm.com, we were going to get spun out of MicroStrategy, and we needed someone to just look at like there was the accounting system that MicroStrategy had, which was the official books. And then there was kind of what we were using operationally and trying to reconcile those. So I spent a ton of time with the finance team then. Because I had done that, they then asked me to help connect our operational system to the new accounting system once we were spun out. So that kind of like ends this chapter. And then a few years later, we were expanding internationally and we needed to do international billing in different currencies and think about FX and taxes and all these other things. So I helped with that project. And all of that kind of just prepared me for now where I am today, and actually kind of running the organization and thinking about the finance and accounting across 3 different jurisdictions with 3 different tax laws and all these other things. And like, I'm not doing any of the accounting, but understanding enough to talk to our accountants and make sense of it. That's like just one area. I can also think about HR where, you thought about kind of organizational dynamics during the MEM, and then I jumped in and helped with, I mentioned kind of the onboarding of employees and doing recruiting, which kind of were like volunteer jobs when I was at Alarm. It was like, I still have this other job, but sure, I'll help with recruiting, I'll help with this onboarding. And then when I was at Formlabs, actually, the people operations team reported to me, and now here I am kind of basically running HR. Again, I have lots of help. We use outside consultants. I'm not doing everything myself, but I have enough of an understanding. And all of those came from like, somebody needs to do this, fine, I'll raise my hand. I'll be the one that jumps in and does that. And I think you have to be in the right role. We wouldn't want all of our engineers doing that. We want them to be focused on building the product. But if you put yourself in the right position to do that, and I think product managers, and kind of, certainly being in a leadership development program gives you that opportunity to just try different things. And being outside of your comfort zone, I think is helpful. I think we also live in a time when like it's a little bit easier to try things that you've never done before because there's so many resources out there. One of the things that Max, the CEO at Formlabs, did, which at the time drove me crazy, is you'd be in a meeting and he would be Googling kind of whatever subject matter you were talking about, and then he would disagree with you because he was like, well, I found a different answer on the internet, basically. And it drove me nuts at the time, but it's also a sign just like there's so many resources out there. We don't always have to reinvent the wheel. And so being someone who's resourceful and finding, okay, what are the areas where I do need to innovate, right? As a tech startup, there's a lot of innovation that happens, but there's other areas where you don't need to innovate. Somebody's done it before. You need to find that and maybe use that template. So being able to get that, and it's also easy to find, right? Like there's a lot of resources on the internet. I don't have to necessarily go back and get a degree in whatever that thing is. I can find some resources. And if you have enough of a background and basis from your education, then you can kind of learn from those and move forward. Yeah, the other things that I think are important, just like we already talked about, just being like have a good understanding of risk and what kind of risk you're comfortable with. That's really helpful. And you just have to evaluate that for yourself as kind of figure out what the risks are at the organization that you're joining and how comfortable are you with those risks.
Yeah, and how do you mitigate them? Like always have a plan B. And
yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, I can imagine, just having this wealth of knowledge and being comfortable enough to know where to look and what to kind of actually take in versus what to say, no, that does not pass my sanity check. And,
right.
There has to be a better answer or a different answer to that one.
Yeah, and that's certainly a problem with the internet. There's a lot of things that are wrong.
That's right, especially now. I feel like, before it took a little bit more work to put stuff on the internet, but now things are so easy that you can argue yourself on both sides of the equation without, and in some cases it's good to have different perspectives, but in some cases there is a right answer, and then you need to be able to be smart enough to be able to discern between the two. What were some of the most difficult challenges you've had to deal with in your roles with startups?
Yeah. Well, so I think the last few years, COVID was something that kind of, I think everyone in any leadership at any organization struggled with. We actually raised our Series A in March of 2020, and in fact had investors who had committed and then pulled out last minute because their LPs said, sorry, we're not, you can't write any checks right now. And so it was just a strange time, and knowing how to navigate that, especially as a young organization, we let some people go or laid them off just because we didn't think we were going to have work. But in retrospect, I think I would have been more aggressive with that because we ended up spending money for a while that, and we weren't making progress on things. But I mean, that's just a challenge. Those are the things that you have no control over. I think outside of that, I think pivoting is really hard to do, kind of, especially you've committed time and resources to something, and we're dealing with that right now, where we spent 4 years building a negotiation platform, and every day is kind of like, we're not selling it, we're not using it regularly. We think we will again in the future. We are describing it right now as an anchor we drag around everywhere we go. Like, we could make some different technology decisions if we didn't think we were ever going to use the negotiation again. And so there's this emotional attachment that I have, that the engineers who wrote that code have, and we're thinking we're in a different place now. We're selling something slightly different, but how do you make those decisions? And those are tough decisions to make. I know when I joined Alarm in my first week, we talked about there's this one specific type of customer that, kind of the statement was, we will never work with them. Like, they're not the type of customer that we want. And literally 2 years later, me and the other person who started at the same time, Colin Murray, who's also a Dartmouth MEM, like, we spent probably 90% of our time on those specific type of customers. And he still, I think, is doing that work, 15 years later. It was just one of those things where like, okay, we were sure we would never do that. And then you have to pivot. And now they became a huge part of the business for alarm.com. And so knowing when do you make those pivots, when do you throw things away and just start over is hard. And you have to do that in all these other little ways as well. Kind of as the company grows, someone else is, like right now I am in charge of all these other things, but in 2 or 3 years, hopefully we have a head of HR. So I'm no longer in charge of HR. Now we have like a chief, so whoever's in charge of legal, right? Whoever kind of, and now they're in charge of legal. I'm not in charge of it. There's just this letting go of things. And so you have to hold things lightly and knowing when is the right time to bring someone else in. Those are the things that are hard. And I see it certainly kind of, I've seen that at Alarm, at Form Labs, and I even see it some at CCX where, people have a nice big domain and it's going to get smaller as more people join, or you're not going to know everything going on. And it's really, it's difficult, but it's a sign of progress and growth. And so you have to do that. And I think one of the last things that's hard is just the quick decision making you need to make as a leader within a startup, and the fact that humans are involved. I mean, I think firing people it's a challenge every time. Sometimes it's the right decision, it's the right decision for the organization, it's maybe even the right decision for the employee, but it still stinks, right? You're telling someone that they're no longer needed or wanted, and that's hard. And then on top of that, like just for us, like dealing with different regulatory environments, some of the European countries, it takes many months even. And so we raised money last June. Prior to that, we were essentially like, basically living month to month. We would either raise some angel investment or get a customer to pay us, and we would like survive another 60 days or whatever. But in some European countries, you have to give 3 months notice. I was like, well, I don't even have that much cash on hand. And so having to make a decision there really early before we got to that point, even though we probably would have held on to those employees longer, but because of the regulatory environment we struggle with. So these are like all these jumble of things that you have to think through as you're making decisions. And it's hard as a startup, kind of things need to be able to move quickly. And there's certainly pulling on the heartstrings, also regulatory thing, all these different inputs you need to think about as you make decisions. So that's
And what's fascinating to me is that usually you would assume that a larger organization would be the organization dealing with such problems, like especially the international regulations and so on and so forth, right? And then a larger organization would have a team dedicated who knows the laws in that country, kind of working with it, or have a separate team, just, the HR part of it, as you said. But in a startup, specifically at CCX, because it looks like it operates across multiple countries and so on and so forth, that it's a startup, so it falls to the COO to kind of have to deal with it or worry about it and have the knowledge about it as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that's unique. And I would probably encourage anyone, if they're doing their own startup, try and stick to one jurisdiction. That might make your life easier. There's lots of reasons why we're having to do it this way. It kind of that we created this mess for ourselves and now we're dealing with it. But it is, as I said, it's a great learning experience. And I feel fortunate that I'm getting to learn through it. Yeah, that doesn't make it less challenging.
Yeah, I can totally imagine. If anybody has questions for Peter, well, please use the Q&A box and let us know, and I can relay them to Peter, and Peter can answer those if you don't mind. If not, we'll continue our conversation. Oh, there you go. It says, we have a question from one of the attendees, and the question says, how do you know when a startup has grown to the point that there needs to be established processes and procedures? Also, how do you convince a team that is used to minimal structure that the processes will help efficiency?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think things start to fray, and that's kind of the first sign. And it means much more kind of people involvement just to keep things straight. And actually, we just went through this. So last June we were at 5 people, and now we're at 15. Most of that on the engineering side, and we were very loosely using Jira to track our issues. But we've now really established much clearer processes. I mean, there's now 4 engineers writing code. We have dedicated QA. It's like everything has changed. And I think our head of technology was spending a lot of his time just making sure we had coordinated between all these people. It's like, okay, like there's established processes. It's pretty obvious. Like we need something in place. You need to assign tickets to different people. Kind of the normal software development cycle, which could be implemented. And then I think like you kind of think about adding just enough to kind of solve that problem at that point. We could have been like, you could be overbearing at that point, but we have a fairly simple process. It's like 5 steps. Everybody has to be a bit comfortable with some ambiguity at different places. And like, recently we were just having this conversation around like, well, is this a bug or is this an enhancement? And kind of everyone on the call thankfully said like, it doesn't really matter. Like an engineer needs to write code and then it needs to get tested. Like it's a ticket, it's in the system. Like in the future, I could see that would matter a lot more. Was this a bug found during QA? Was it a bug found in production? And like, you need to track all that stuff. But for now, we knew an engineer needed to do work. And so there was a ticket and who cares what it was called? And so, it's adding enough so that everybody continues to work efficiently. If everyone is having to call each other to make sure they know where things are, or in that case, our head of engineering was spending all of his time kind of running around, making sure people knew what was going on, that becomes a problem. And at least I personally probably would be on the side of like just a little bit under what you probably need is probably okay, because then people start demanding it. And so I think that's sometimes a little bit of an easier, if like the entire team comes to you and be like, this is disorganized, we need to add some systems and processes, then you're like, I'd be happy to do that. But it's now not overbearing, the COO coming down and saying, we must do things this way. That is hard to create that change. And I think this is like, it's a little bit easier if they're demanding it a little bit. I know not everyone agrees with my approach on that, but that's certainly the approach I've taken for that type of thing.
I think that's a brilliant strategy. It's a push versus pull, right?
Right.
Like you pushing on processes versus being pulled, like being asked for, if you will.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the times you want to be perfect, you want to think of all the eventualities and you want to give the perfect solution, but that might be just too much for
Yeah.
people, and then you get pushback, right? So as you said, I think that is brilliant.
Yeah.
And great advice too. Any more questions for Peter? Please feel free to get them out there. Use the Q&A box at the bottom. It should be on the bottom panel. My question for you, apart from all the conversation we've had, and the 3 companies you joined were not necessarily working in the same domain, right? So how do you handle switching domains, especially in a startup environment where A, you are expected to wear multiple hats, but then B, the expectation is that you hit the ground running and you are productive starting day one?
Yeah, I think so one is like, one was home security, home automation, then there's 3D printing, and now there's, software for healthcare. Those are all very different, but they do have kind of the similarity of it, all of them, except for now, all of them had a software and a hardware component, and it was technology being built. And the positions I was in were always very similar, kind of, so what I was doing was similar within those different organizations. I think where I have found, and some of it has to do with how quickly the organization can bring you up to speed. And admittedly, I think Formlabs is like probably like the one where I failed the most at really understanding 3D printing. I probably average understanding of 3D printing, but there wasn't a great onboarding experience to get people up to speed. And when I joined Alarm, it was small enough. I could ask anybody any question at any point. And we have some people, both advisors and some former employees at CCX who understand market access worlds really well and were willing to answer all those questions. And that's kind of, I think most people that joined Formlabs were like super excited about 3D printing and so already understood it. And I just didn't have the ability to ask all those questions. But you need to create a culture where kind of people can ask those questions, go to understand things. People are willing to give them the time. It's certainly like kind of the old adage of like, there are no stupid questions. Like you need to be willing to ask those questions about what's going on to really understand. And I think as the person going through those steps, you need to know what do I know and know how to do well, and what are the areas where I don't understand. And so for me, I think across in most of those situations, I knew what my skill set was, how I could add value. And then the specific context was the one I didn't know, but when I first started Alarm, I had the MEM experience. I kind of had just gone through how do you manage a project. And so, like these things were kind of very salient in my mind. I was like, okay, I know how to do that part. Now I need to understand how does the security system work. Or I've done enough HR or kind of other ops stuff, and I've built a board presentation that when I ended up at Formlabs, like I could put that stuff together. But I didn't know the specific of 3D printing. And so just kind of being really clear with yourself on what are the things that you do know and what are the things that you don't know, and kind of rely on your strengths, and then be willing to ask the questions on the areas where you do need to learn. And again, Google is super helpful. You can ask a lot of questions there, and it's worth spending the time to do that. And I'd say it's so obvious when people have done that during interviews. Now that I'm interviewing people again, some people show up and they're like, I don't know what market access is. Can you explain it to me? And other people clearly, even if they're not from this industry, have spent a lot of time, and they may not fully get it, but their questions are so much more intelligent. If they just, it's really just 30 minutes before you do an interview. Make sure you understand what that company does, kind of what the world that they operate in is. You don't need to know everything. They don't expect you to, but to have at least done a little bit of research makes a big difference.
I can imagine. And then, as you said, I think having the resources, right, especially as a startup, like having the people you can lean on to get information, because that's information that's not easily available, I would assume, not out in the public domain. And this is really domain expertise that you're looking for, or even just experience, right? Like, have you navigated a situation XYZ like that,
Right.
which
Yeah.
is sometimes very unique, especially when it comes to startups, when you're operating in certain industries for sure.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. That is great. Perfect. I think those were more or less the questions I had, and I don't see any more questions coming through. Um, Peter, do you have any advice for our current and prospective MEM students on life, career?
There was one thing we didn't, I know I wrote
Yeah.
it down in my notes, but we never talked
No, we
about,
have
and that
time.
is
Yep, sure.
just when you like putting yourself, and one of the things that I think was great about the MEM is putting you kind of naturally into project management roles or product management. They're a similar, and where you have to lead through influence, not with authority. And I think that's a great skill set. I was recently talking with an employee who was like, well, like, if you want me to have any type of leadership, you need to like make me the boss, basically. And it's funny because this particular person is someone who, like, even when I tell them to do something, they don't do it. But I just wanted to say, like, just because you have a fancy title, it helps a little bit. People do stuff what you ask them to do, but being to influence people, even when you don't have authority, that skill set is so much more valuable. Whether that, you go into understand their point of view, what is motivating them, asking questions, and then bringing them along to your point of view, or kind of helping understand why this might be the right thing to do. That skill set is so much more valuable, and you have to do that when you're a project manager. Very rarely is project manager at the top of the organization. You're like somewhere matrixed in, and everyone's like, why is this person running around? But it is your responsibility to get things across the finish line by coordinating everyone else's work. And that skill set is super valuable. And I think makes me, even though now I do have the fancy title to some extent, it's a small company. So, but I know how to influence people on that way. And I think people are much more receptive to that. They understand better. They're going to buy into why you're doing what you're doing, as opposed to me sending an email saying, I'm the CEO, you must do XYZ thing, having them come along. It's similar to what I was talking about kind of with change management and bringing in processes. Like, have them bring that to the table, have them be co-creators. That's going to help a lot. And I think the skill set that the MEM gives you helps you be in roles that are going to teach you that skill as well. It's kind of, it's like do the job you want, or I don't know what the quote is, but you want to be doing that type of thing, even when you don't have the title. It's going to make it easier to move into that role later on. So that's something I'd say the MEM helps quite a bit with, is kind of putting you in those positions.
No, that is very true. That is very true, right? Because not everybody will have a leadership position. You might have a leadership role, as in you're expected to lead and, deliver outcomes, but you may not have the title or the authority.
Right.
And as you said, like, you could still have the title and the authority, and you still have to bring people along and get their buy-in, because we all know that nobody likes to be told what to do unless they
Right.
understand why we're doing it, right? If you
Right.
will. That's a
Yeah.
great skill set. It's good to know that. I mean, now that I think about it, I can imagine it's even more important in a startup. But I know that it's really important in a large organization because
Right.
there's just sheer number of people you have to bring along, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time, Peter. This was an amazing conversation. I hope everybody who joined us enjoyed it. Um, I am recording the conversation. I'll send the recording out. So if you missed it, you can definitely go back to it. In case anybody has questions, can they reach out to you on LinkedIn?
Yeah,
Are
just
you
make
good with
sure, I'd say just make sure they, mention
put a note?
just say, like, I heard the webinar, or I missed the
Yeah.
webinar and had a question, that's fine. There's lots of LinkedIn requests, and I tend to ignore the ones that don't have at least some words, so I know why
Yes.
someone is reaching out.
And I
So,
think that's a good tip no matter what. Like, no
yeah.
matter when you're reaching out, I've found that when I connect with people, I end up putting a note as to where we met,
Yeah,
partially because I make connection requests to so many people. And then when I really want to reach out to a person, I don't remember where we met. But if I
right.
already have that message in, then it kind of starts my conversation saying, hey, it was great meeting you at SWE. I'm like, now I know where we
Yeah,
met, and
exactly.
then we can build on it. So no, that's a good tip. So yes, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to Peter on LinkedIn. But please put in a note that you watched this webinar and you had a question, or you are an MEM student and you have a question, however it works out. Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much for your time, Peter. We absolutely enjoyed it. And I hope you have a great evening and rest of the week. And I look forward to hearing more about CCX and your journey going forward.
Thanks, Ritu. It was really fun to do this. I appreciate it. So
Thank
thanks.
you. Take
Yeah,
care.
take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.
Bye, everyone.